Why moving to Eastern Europe could be one of the best decisions of your lifetime. We're going to talk about some of the key benefits that you can enjoy when living in Eastern Europe, and also wanted to point out some of the facts that I think are really important. When we talk about Eastern Europe, I think we have to differentiate because there's two groups of countries here. There are countries that are part of the European Union, and those countries include Czech Republic, Poland, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovenia. I'm sure I've forgotten one at least. And then of course there's also countries that are not part of the European Union, and those countries include Serbia, Albania, Montenegro, and also Croatia. But Croatia is about to join the European Union. Basically how that affects you is just in terms of visa policy. Let's say if you have a European Union passport, then you can go live in any of the Eastern European countries that are part of the European Union without needing a visa. Well, that's great. So if you have, let's say, a French passport, if you have a German passport, if you have a Spanish passport, if you're a citizen of Ireland, you can go live in any Eastern European country that's part of the European Union and do that without a visa. Now, how does that look for people that are not part of the European Union? Let's say you are American, you are Canadian, Australian, you're from Latin America. If you're from any country that's not part of the European Union, well, you get a 90-day visa and you can stay for up to 90 days within a 180-day window. That's for Eastern European Union countries, right? So countries in Eastern Europe that are part of the European Union. Then there's of course other countries. There is Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, Bosnia. Now for those countries, you can stay in those countries also for up to 90 days. What a lot of people from outside the European Union will do is they would just rotate back and forth between Eastern European countries that are part of the EU, so they're going to spend 90 days in those countries, then they leave the EU zone and they go to an Eastern European country that is not part of the EU. Let's get started talking about the pros of living in Eastern Europe, because there's so many. What's great about Eastern Europe is that you can actually own land, you can own property, something that's not really possible in Southeast Asia, pretty much impossible for a foreigner, for a non-citizen to own land in most across Southeast Asia. Now in Eastern Europe, doesn't matter if you're Canadian, if you're American, if you're Australian, if you're European, if you're from Latin America, if you're from Africa, you can own land in Eastern Europe. That's great. And it's important for people that want to establish themselves. Yeah, let's talk about residency and citizenship. You can become a resident or a citizen in Eastern European countries, and I think that's great because, again, if we compare to Southeast Asia, you can not become a citizen. Very difficult. You can become a citizen of the Philippines and Cambodia. Those are really the only two countries that allow you to become a citizen, but also with a lot of contingencies, so it's not so easy, not so straightforward. Now in Eastern Europe, okay, it's definitely doable to become a citizen, but you have to learn the language. You must have lived in the country for at least X number of years to become a citizen. So of course there is a contingency, right? There is obviously some things attached in order for you to make that happen. But at least it's possible. It's not possible in Southeast Asia. And that's what people love about Eastern Europe, that it's easy to become a resident and citizen, that it's possible. Taxes are another big benefit. If we take a look at Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, in those countries you may only pay 10% taxes. If we take a look at Bulgaria, if you become a resident of Bulgaria, you spend more than 180 days in Bulgaria each year, then if you earn $500,000 a year, you would pay 10% of that money in taxes, right? So it's a very liberal tax policy. If we compare it to Western European countries, let's talk about Germany, France, if we talk about Portugal, the tax rates in those countries is enormous. In France, it's more than 50%. In Germany, it's 50%. It's just very high. So if you can live in Bulgaria or Romania, you can reduce your taxes by a lot. Western citizens move to Eastern Europe because of the cheap cost of living. If you come from a place like England, Canada, the United States, Australia, if you come from any Western European country, you're going to save a lot of money that you would have spent on living costs back home by just moving to Eastern Europe, and having a great life, because it doesn't mean that in order for you to spend less, you actually have to cut down that much. That's not the case, because in Eastern Europe, in most countries, probably the Czech Republic is an exception, and probably also Estonia is more expensive, but in most Eastern European countries, you just pay a lot less. Everything is cheaper, rent is cheaper, food is cheaper, gasoline is cheaper, everything is cheaper, services are cheaper. So whatever you spend back home, let's say you had a budget of $4,000 in Canada, if you have the same budget in, let's say, a place like Hungary, you have a much greater purchasing power. And that's one of the biggest reasons why people from Western countries move to Eastern Europe. Westerners appreciate Eastern European people because they're very direct, they don't fiddle around, they don't talk around the bush. They're actually very direct, and some people get insulted, they get offended, because to them it's very, just weird for a person to be so direct. Like if an Eastern European person thinks, the weather outside is not so good, they're going to tell you, the weather today, it sucks, it's not good. Whereas in the United States, they would say, well, it's raining today, and it's just a great time to do this and that. Well, in Eastern Europe, they would probably say it very differently. They're very direct, they're very, upfront. They don't really talk around the bush, and that's probably a thing that you have to get used to if you're from a very polite country, if you're from a very indirect country where that's not the case. But I think people appreciate that about Eastern Europeans. What people also appreciate about Eastern Europeans is that they're just, very open-minded, that they're actually very good at languages. They speak multiple languages, because if you're from a country like Slovakia or, for instance, Albania, Bulgaria, your language does not do that much in terms of like you being able to get a job, or if you want to go to a different country, you have to speak different languages. So naturally, if you find an Eastern European who speaks at least 3 languages, just don't be surprised. It's actually very common. And of course, Western men appreciate the dating scene in Eastern Europe. It's a fantastic place for dating, because Eastern Europe looks up to Western Europe in many ways, especially when it comes to like improving themselves, whatever that means in terms of economic strength, in terms of just moving to a different country. Like they're very open-minded. So naturally, for a Western man to have success in Eastern Europeans' dating scene is actually not uncommon. It's actually very common. So a lot of Western men, they move to Eastern Europe, they end up with Polish wives, with Ukrainian wives, they end up with Serbian wives. It doesn't matter where they meet their crush, they found them in Eastern Europe, and they were actually very happy that they took the risk to go to the region in order to make that happen. I do want to add that the age gap is not that big of a deal in most Eastern European countries. Of course, there are exceptions like Hungary, the Czech Republic. In some countries it's going to be more of an issue than in others, but in most Eastern European countries, if you're a guy who is, let's say, 10 years, 15 years older than the girl, it's not a big deal. Of course, there's also some cons. Like there is in any other region, Eastern Europe has some cons. And some of these cons include the weather. If we take a look at Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, long cold winters in those countries. Or Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, very cold, long winters. And that's what some people don't get accustomed to, because they want warmer climate. If they are from, let's say, a southern state, or if they are from Australia, if they have been living in Southeast Asia or in Latin America, they may find it difficult to adjust, because the weather in Eastern Europe is not so good, for like 6 months throughout the year. But that's not the case in Albania. It's not the case in like Bulgaria, if you live in like Varna. It depends on where you're located. So you can have a bit of a longer summer or a slower transition if you live in a place like Montenegro, Albania, Croatia, than you would if you lived in a place like Warsaw, Poland. It would be different in Poland than it is in Albania. So that's something to consider. Because some Eastern European countries are developing countries, they are polluted. There's less regulation, and there is just old vehicles on the road, so there's more air pollution, there's more noise, there's more light pollution. Those things just exist in Eastern Europe, and you may not find them, let's say in North America, in Western Europe. Another con is that you cannot become a dual citizen in most countries. What do you think about living in Eastern Europe? Do you think it's a good choice? Do you think people should consider moving to the region given all the benefits that we just mentioned? Leave a comment below and let us know. Consider subscribing if you haven't already. I'm uploading new videos on digital nomad locations, travel updates, and investment advice several times a week right now. And if you got some more time left, check out these videos.